Securing unequivocal bids. That's our next important tactic in the overall strategy of cost control beyond design. I get tired of seeing owners sign in good faith a contract that's based on a squishy bid. We're going to talk about a whole lot of strategies that will help make that proposed contract sum irreducible, solid, and signable. The unequivocal bid is the simplest of all proposals. The contractor will build this, the owner will pay that, period. But it's the unicorn in the construction industry. Everybody knows what it should look like. You can picture it in your mind, but anyone who claims to have actually seen one is thought to be a little bit off. I've seen one, but only one that was truly spontaneous in my entire career, and this was about 30 years ago. I was a young architect, had a small project. There were two local general contractors bidding it. They were both elderly gentlemen, very dignified, very stoic. They reminded me a lot of Clint Eastwood and Jack Palance. When the day of the bid came, they each brought a single number 10 business envelope to my office. The first gentleman brought it in about an hour before the bids were due and tossed it on my reception counter and kind of grunted and walked out. That was Clint Eastwood. The other guy came in about 30 minutes before the bids were due, and he smiled, he asked to see me and shook my hand, and he handed me the envelope, and I don't think he said anything. Then he walked out. Then a half hour later the owner came, and we had a very short bid opening. It was all of about a minute. We opened each envelope, and there was exactly one sheet of paper. It was the bid form that I had prepared. There were about 4 lines of explanation and the attestation that the contractor had visited the job site and examined the construction documents. And they proposed to carry out the work of the contract for X dollars in so many calendar days, and they signed it. It took a half a sheet of paper. The owner was pretty happy. After 5 minutes, he got up and walked out. I sent a thank you letter to both of them and announced which bidder was the apparent low bidder. And I think the owner called him and it went straight to contract. I've never seen that again. I've tried to coax out unequivocal bids. I've tried to bribe them out and cajole them out. I even used gotcha language, which several contractors informed me that they found particularly offensive. I eventually realized that what I wanted in a bid was not the same thing that the contractors wanted to present to the owner, and it was frankly not what the owner wanted to receive from the contractors. My idea of a perfect bid was the clean, simple, one-page statement with no allowances or caveats, and go straight to contract with that, build the job, close it out. The contractors wanted to have an opportunity to meet with the owner, discuss their proposal, present their qualifications, introduce a project manager, and basically sell or negotiate the project. The owners wanted something completely different from that. They wanted to get in under the hood of the bid and see how the different line items added up, and whether they were spending a lot on flooring or plumbing, see how this subcontractor compared with that subcontractor. They wanted to see it all. It wasn't till about 10 years ago that I really realized that the standard bidding procedure that I had followed religiously for years was never going to get the results that I was looking for, or that the owner needed, or that the general contractor needed. Everybody's interests needed some nuancing in the bid process. The process that I work with today, which has evolved over about a decade, comes the closest of anything that I've seen to actually getting us there, to an unequivocal bid that the contractor agrees with, the owner's happy with, and the architect is confident in. It's a complex process. I've actually identified a 10-step procedure that I review with an owner and make sure they buy in at each step of the way. There are a lot of individual steps. It begins with a pre-qualification period where contractors are invited to submit their statements of qualifications, and they're reviewed, and they're either found to be acceptable or not. Normally they are. And then that process closes out. The following step is to issue an invitation to bid to exactly the number of contractors that you're interested in. I recommend 3. If there's some doubt, maybe 4. I believe that if you get 5 or more contractors involved in the project, you'll see diminishing returns. Those contractors view the job as a long shot, and they're just not going to work the bid process hard. One of the reasons that I like to have a confirmed list of bidders before the invitation goes out is that about 3 or 4 days after the bids hit the streets, the owner and the architect are going to start getting calls from cousins and former clients and everybody who's got a name of somebody who should be on that bid list. And the simple answer is, that sounds great, but we closed out the qualification period 2 weeks ago. Maybe next time. I really advise the owner how important it is at that point not to allow any other bidders to jump into this game. It's an integrity check for the owner. The bidders who have been invited to bid and who are investing a great amount of money to really boil that number down, they take great offense when someone comes in from left field halfway through the process. If that happens, there's a good chance that at least 1 or 2 of those bidders are just going to throw their hands up and say, you know what, we'll just wait till the day before the bid and call around town and collect all the numbers from the subs and we'll turn it in. I've lost interest. There are several other steps in an effective bidding process. It includes discovery that I talked about in part 2 of this presentation. It includes the bid form where the contractor attests to the fact that they've reviewed the entire discovery file. Today I'm going to highlight 3 of these steps, and these are the ones that have the most bearing on owners. Now, the first step that I think is an owner mandate is that they must allow the architect to manage all communications during the bidding process. It's a complicated process and it needs a traffic cop. And it's difficult to do this, but I literally ask the owner to agree to a 30-day blackout with respect to discussing the project with any of the bidders. Let me illustrate why this is important. This is a real scenario. The bidders are always going to include at least 1 or 2 close colleagues of the owner. These are people that they've known for years, they're good friends, they're well respected, they may have kids that play on the same soccer team, so they see each other socially. In one of those social contexts, the bidder asks the owner a simple question. You've got some perfectly good plumbing fixtures that are left over from the last tenant. They're 2 years old, they look like new. Is there any reason why we just can't reuse those instead of furnishing the new plumbing fixtures that are specified in the drawings? The owner says, yeah, sure, I want to save money. If you think that's a good idea, yeah, do it. Great. Well, there are a few other things we've seen on the project that they don't necessarily make sense. We think we could save some additional money if we could use a few other existing things or change a detail here or there. Well, yeah, I want you to use your best judgment. I'm looking for the best price. I got to get it. Got to get the best price, so sure. Use your judgment. That simple statement transfers tacit authority to that bidder to use their own judgment as to the meaning or the intent of the contract documents and to decide on a case-by-case basis whether the literal requirements of the contract documents must be followed or whether their judgment can be substituted. When that happens, the owner normally doesn't realize it was a significant event. But I assure you there will be complications later in the process because this contractor understands that their moral responsibility is to use their judgment to interpret the project requirements in the manner they perceive is in their friend, the owner's, best interest. And the contract documents prepared by the architect are relegated to suggestions. I talk about this a little bit more in our section on common preambles to change orders. But the bottom line is this: the owner is now at risk of losing control of either the cost ceiling or the project quality, and possibly both. Now, this is a hard thing to ask of the owner. They want to be hands-on, they want to be involved, and they really believe that they're capable of controlling what they say and Not saying anything that could be misinterpreted, but often that's not true. This is a complicated process. It's got a special language that's nuanced. So really the best advice I can give to an owner for self-preservation is to agree to the blackout and allow the architect to represent them in all communications during the bidding process. Another request that I make of the owner is to resist the temptation to try and micromanage the contractor's bid. I also ask an owner to resist the curiosity of trying to get into the individual details of the bid and see how the line items stack up and see how the total contract sum could be changed if this number were substituted with that number. That's not the owner's business at this point. That's solely the general contractor's business. The premise of an unequivocal bid is that the general contractor is an entrepreneur. They're not a manager. They're not an employee working for the owner. They're a standalone business entity. How they allocate the contract sum within their business is their business. They can make money, they can break even, or they can lose money within the container of their business. The unequivocal bid gives them a contract sum that they allocate between their various suppliers and subcontractors. And within that context, the subs and the suppliers can represent profit, break even, or loss in the individual categories of work. The contractor's responsibility is to take the extra proceeds from the profitable categories of work and move it over into the columns where the losses occurred and cover it without altering the contract sum. If you're going to ask a contractor to assume that kind of responsibility, then you can't look over their shoulder and suggest that you bit twiddle with their numbers. This concept that the owner only reviews the net bid is entirely consistent with the AIA contract document system. In fact, in the AIA general conditions to the contract, the schedule of values is defined as a document that the contractor produces as shortly after the signing of the contract as possible, where they allocate the entire contract sum across all of the various categories of work. And the owner really doesn't see that at the time of bidding, but that document is used by the owner and the architect thereafter. It's the benchmark against which payment applications and requests for change orders are compared. If the owner has an irresistible appetite for the bit twiddling, then I would maybe suggest they look at a cost-plus agreement with a guaranteed max, in which case the contractor is not an entrepreneur, they're a manager working for the owner in good faith. So for an owner that wants to be hands-on, that type of contract is probably good, but it still needs a guaranteed maximum cost, which is essentially the same thing as the unequivocal bid. If the guaranteed maximum cost in a cost-plus agreement gets compromised or pushed up by virtue of change orders, then that's no different than signing a stipulated sum contract that also gets pushed up by virtue of change orders. In the final section on common preambles to change orders, I talk a little bit more about the risk that the owner takes when they try and pierce this private business entity and get involved with reviewing the individual line item costs on a stipulated sum contract. The main point that I'm trying to make now is that there will be a request placed on the owner to curb that curiosity if the goal is to truly obtain the unequivocal bid. The final part of the bidding process that I want to talk about right now for securing an unequivocal bid has to do with the reconciliation of bid caveats. It is impossible today to have contractors turn in the true unequivocal bid without at least giving them the opportunity to explain some caveats. There have been times when I've tried to secure unequivocal bids and the process has completely gone out the window. The contractors turn in their bids with attached caveats, line item allowances, and proposed substitutions, all kinds of things that make the bid muddy. Sometimes I think it's intentional because, like I said, what the contractor really wants, and even the owner wants, is an opportunity to sit down with the bidder and kind of go through the whole process. So I understand that, and I have yielded to it. I expect that 90% of the bid will be solid, and I expect the contractor to sign the bid form for an unequivocal bid with no further negotiations except for a few areas of caveat that are specifically defined with a bid form attachment, one sheet per one caveat. Now what that means is this. There should be 90% of any bid that is unquestionable. The 10% that's still squishy needs to be ironed out with the owner on a line item by line item basis. I provide in the bid forms templates for 5 different types of bid form attachments. And by the way, that evolves a little bit. I used to use 4. I might use a few others in the future. But I've identified the basic caveats that are common. One of them is the line item allowance. This is a single category of work that can be identified on a one-sheet bid attachment where the scope of the work is described, the proposed allowance is described, and at the bottom of that there is a reconciliation line where this allowance can be permanently monetized. It might be a higher number than the proposed allowance, but this is the number that the contractor is willing to lock in, and if the owner agrees to it, they will both sign off on this bid form attachment, and that one category of work is no longer an allowance. It's a fixed cost that is part of the unequivocal bid. Another example of a bid form attachment that I use is for a proposed substitution. The contractor always has some better suggestions for value, and I want the owner to take advantage of that, but we cannot allow those things to be presumed in the contract sum. We now offer a one-page bid form attachment for the proposed substitution. And here the contractor can list the alternate product or method that they prefer. They can describe its merits. They can explain to the owner the added value, whether it's direct cost savings or whether it's an increased warranty, whatever that added value is. They can list it and describe it and negotiate it with the owner as a single line item. And that one line item in that one bid form attachment now becomes a modification to the unequivocal contract sum. Well, this process is now carried out through every caveat that there is. Those don't matter what they are. What matters is that they're individualized, they're described and negotiated on a line item by line item basis, they're monetized, and they're signed off on by both parties. The unequivocal bid is still unequivocal with a half a dozen or so modifications, and this satisfies everybody. The contractor gets to do what they want to do, which is if they're the apparent low bidder, they're going to get the call to sit down with the owner and review the bid. But we're not going to talk about 90% of it. We're going to look at these half a dozen sheets that have been attached to the bid form that are the individual caveats that are negotiated and monetized one at a time. The owner gets what the owner wants. They get to look under the hood. They get to touch test and feel the general contractor. They get to figure out how they think. The architect gets what they want. So the process of using bid form attachments is a key strategy as long as it's properly enforced. This is going to take a strong presentation from the architect during the bidding process to explain that general caveats are not to be offered and will not be considered. Individual line item caveats only can be submitted one sheet at a time as a bid form attachment. The contractors know that if they come in with 42 bid form attachments, it's not going to be worth considering. It'll be muddy water. So they typically will come in with half a dozen. Perfect. Let's get to the unequivocal contract sum. The reason I'm so passionate about the unequivocal contract sum is that it's really the proxy for so many other things that I believe make for good and effective project management. You either have an unequivocal contract sum or you have a squishy bid. And if you have a squishy bid, you're going to be renegotiating costs again and again throughout the entire contract process, and that can be a very long carnival ride. I hope that you will add the term unequivocal contract sum to your vocabulary and start using it on your projects with your architect and your bidders. I think it'll serve you well. Securing unequivocal bids. It turns out that is one of the most difficult strategies in this overall program for cost control beyond design. Now let's move on to the next important topic: common preambles to change orders.